They called him Monkhelm, not a surname, not a title, but a whisper passed between soldiers, monks, and the condemned alike, in the shadow-drenched corners of the eastern principalities. During the waning years of the Black Banner Wars, he was the last face thousands would ever see. No one knew his true name: a priest, a midwife, a court painter, a foreign alchemist. When he woke, his wife, Queen Isabella, sat by the bed, pale as death, whispering, "I told you." All he saw was a raven feather drifting down on the current of air. The king felt a sudden lurch of fear, remembering Isabella's words, "I told you so." He watched the feather float to the floor, brushing against the hem of his silk robe. That night, the jailer refused his nightly flagons of wine, for the condemned were his friends and he would not turn traitor. So, the captain of the guard went himself, bearing a torch and steel-capped boots echoing on the flagstone floors. "I told you what would come when you let him in." She turned to go, then paused. "He waits for you now." In cell 2, the young woman with emerald eyes stared at the wall, her fingers tracing patterns in the mortar. The third cell was empty. The jailer found no one, but the smell of sulfur clung to the air, and the executioner's raven perched on the bars of the empty cell door, croaking softly. The raven watched the jailer closely. When it opened its beak, a tiny scroll unfurled from its throat. The jailer reached out and took it, his hands shaking. The scroll was sealed with wax, and when he broke the seal, a single sentence stood written in flowing script: "The old man is free." As the sun rose, Monkhelm stood before the two remaining prisoners. Behind him, the raven unfolded its wings, big as a man's shield, and the light caught its eyes, twin points of ice fire. The princess with the emerald gaze screamed. The heretic priest only smiled, along with the girl with eyes like emeralds and the old man who smells of sulfur. "Their souls wait for you. Do you hear them?" The king recoiled. Who waits? What are you saying?" But Isabella had vanished, leaving him alone with the raven's echo in his ear and the dread of a new dawn. Whispers of heresy, witchcraft, or sedition were always enough to condemn, but some wondered if Monkhelm was choosing them. He wanted answers, explanations, anything to quiet the unease coiling in his gut. But the executioner stood before him, silent and still as a statue, his face impassive, his eyes like chips of ice. The king gestured to the seat by the hearth, but Monkhelm only shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Very well," the king said, rising, his voice echoing. "You will execute the 3 condemned tonight. Be swift and silent. I want no more questions." Monkhelm inclined his head, a flicker of something like gratitude crossing his face. Then he turned and left, moving with an unsettling grace for so tall a man, selecting them, offering them to something older than law. One night, after execution number 998, a scribe convicted of writing a play that offended no one, the palace guards found Monkhelm standing alone by the execution block, hours after the crowd had gone. He was sharpening his axe slowly, humming a tune no one could recognize. They called to him. He did not answer. They say that was the first time they heard the raven speak. It said, "2 more." Nor his origin, only that he arrived with a raven on his shoulder and an axe that gleamed like wet bone under moonlight. The official records, such as they were, list him only as the royal executioner, beginning in 1641 under King Alaric the Pale, whose court dripped in silk and treason. Monkhelm never wore the hood. He insisted on looking each soul in the eye. He never spoke outside official rite, never ate with others, never left the execution grounds during festival days or military campaigns. Even more strange, he didn't age. Over the decades, while judges grew grey and kings were replaced, Monkhelm's face remained unchanged, pale as parchment, smooth and unwrinkled, like it had been carved from wax and left in the cold. By 1673, his record stood at 997 executions, each one meticulously logged in the royal codex by clerks who noticed that his victims began to share certain peculiarities. His attire was plain, dark wool, leather gloves, a belt with no adornment. But his gaze, it made grown men weep before their heads met the block. At first, he was seen as a necessary evil, a tool of order during a time of chaos. The civil wars had split the kingdom like rotten bark, and executions had become theatre, religion, and deterrent all at once. Mirkhelm brought a strange kind of mercy. His axe never failed. The condemned often begged for him if given a choice, and he delivered his duties not with glee, nor malice, but with an eerie stillness that unsettled even the most hardened captains. But as the years dragged on, a pattern began to form. They were not all criminals. That night, the king dreamt of ravens. Big and black, they scratched at his window, croaking prayers in tongues he did not understand. The next day, the king summoned Morkheim to his throne room. When the king looked up, there was no one there. In cell 1, the heretic priest waited calmly, eyes closed. "Hello, friends." Execution number 999 came on a morning shrouded in yellow fog. The condemned was a young boy, just 13, accused of stealing a sacred relic. From the abbey at Varnhold, the relic was never recovered. Ministers feared assassination, generals refused to leave their chambers. Law and order dissolved, stories told by survivors who saw the impossible. Or was he forever doomed to walk the mortal plane in body and in mind? Share your thoughts, and if you liked the story, show us by giving us a thumbs up. By a man who defied death, who cheated his own execution, leaving behind not a whisper of a name or a trace of a face. Some say when he vanished, he took the secrets of his existence with him. Others, that the knowledge was taken from him, twisted and corrupted until his last moments, dooming him to walk the mortal plane in body and in mind forevermore. The king died of fever or poison depending on who you believe. His corpse was found with his throat shredded, like by talons, but no bird was seen, and the bell of second prayer never rang again. Even the king old Alaric, now sickly and hunch-clocked himself in the catacombs below the palace, guarded by mercenaries and monks alike. He was certain the final name was his, but on the 100th night after the boy's death, Mirkhelm disappeared. His quarters were undisturbed, though the raven was gone. His axe, too. The gallows stood untouched. The guards reported seeing him vanish, literally dissolve into the wind like smoke. Some claimed he walked backward into the fog, into a tear in the air shaped like a doorway of thorns. Others said they never saw him leave, but his shadow no longer stretched along the stone, nor was the abbess who had accused him ever seen again. Yet the trial was swift, and the boy was sentenced to die by the blade. Before the bell of second prayer, the crowd that gathered in the square that day was different. They stood quietly, not out of respect but fear. The guards were pale. The chaplain could barely read the final rites without trembling. Mirkhelm stepped forward. The boy looked up, terrified. Then strangely calm. He said only one thing before the axe fell. "I know who you are." When the head fell, the raven screamed a long, bone-rattling shriek that echoed through the square like a chasm opening beneath the earth. Several in the crowd collapsed. The rest fled. The next morning, 6 witnesses had slit their own throats. 3 were never found. That night, a fire broke out in the archives. All records pertaining to the executioner's identity were destroyed. Not a single portrait remained. It was as if he had never been hired, never sworn his oath, never existed at all. Only the axe remained, resting on its pedestal in the royal armory, slick with something that refused to dry, and still. There was one left, the final name. The royal court grew paranoid. In the days that followed, the kingdom fell into chaos. Without Mirkhelm, executions resumed clumsily, bloodily. Heads took several strokes. The crowds rioted. All that remains of Morkheim is this axe and these stories. Friends, tell me, what do you think? Did Morkel take the secret of his existence with him? The legends tell us many things about Morkheim, the executioner, but they tell us little about the man beneath the mask. So here is one small detail, a glimpse into the mind of a monster. When Morkel took up the office of executioner, he demanded and received the finest quality axe in the kingdom. The handle was crafted from the wood of an ancient pear tree. Its blade was sharpened to a terrifying edge, capable of severing bone and cleaving a human head cleanly from its shoulders. And what did he do with it? How did he? Cleanly, as if by a single stroke, each body kneeling beside its own head. that he emerges not for justice nor vengeance, reports still come in of a man, tall still, faceless. Did you like it? If so, show your support. Until next time. Seen in the fog near train tracks, in abandoned abbeys, outside prison walls. He does not move. He does not speak. But where he stands, things go quiet, as though the world holds its breath. And sometimes, just sometimes, a raven lands on his shoulder and whispers again. But to maintain some dark balance, not between good and evil, but between silence and memory. Each life taken by his hand, a seal on something deeper beneath the world, something that must never wake. And when the 1,000 are done, perhaps then it sleeps, or perhaps that's when it begins. No blood pooled, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow. But every home bore a single black feather on the door, and the axe, yes, the axe was found in the village square embedded in a stone pillar. The pillar had been erected only days before. The inscription at its base read simply, "Here falls the final shadow." The artifact was taken by royal agents locked away in a vault, beneath the Ministry of Historical Mysteries. But 1 year later, it vanished, replaced by a stone cracked down the center as though split by a blade. A man who wielded death as casually as most men wield a dinner knife, treat his most treasured possession. He kept it sharp. You heard me right. He took his axe out of its scabbard every morning, and he sharpened it. Even the great Morculum knew that the finest steel loses its edge over time. To own such a magnificent weapon, to let it rust and dull, would have been an insult. And so, while others slept, or at least they should have been sleeping, he would sit alone in his courtyard, the flickering light of dawn painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, and he would sharpen his axe. Listen to that sound. Doesn't that put you in the mood for a good old-fashioned beheading? Doesn't that make you want to run outside and plant the seeds of your own legend? If you could hear that every morning, wouldn't it be hard not to get up? Wouldn't you feel a sudden surge of inspiration, a burning need to go out and do something great? Of course you would. I'm just saying, sometimes being an executioner has its perks. A century passed. The kingdom was no more. The lands had been broken into petty fiefdoms ruled by petty lords. But the legend of Merkhelm endured, passed on by firelight, by madmen, by folk who claimed their grandfather's uncle had seen the raven in their orchard. Then in 1794, a scholar named Orland Voss discovered a collection of wax-sealed journals. Buried in the foundation of the ruined palace, they contained sketches drawn in maddening, angular lines of the axe, the raven, and the executioner himself. In the final entry dated precisely 100 years after the last execution, the scribe had written, "He walks still. He waits for the last name." The 1,000th was never a person. It was a place. No one knew what that meant until 1811. In a mountain village called Red Hearth, dozens of villagers were found decapitated. They say Merkhelm was no man at all, but a curse, a force, a necessary terror conjured whenever the world forgets the cost of blood. Because late at night, in cities and farmlands alike, that concludes our tale today.